So recently I saw a tweet, and I'm not going to say who made this tweet because I don't want to name and shame them. It's not the worst tweet ever made, it's not bigoted or idiotic, it's not even a particularly unusual mistake. It's just the most concentrated version of a mistake that I think a lot of people make. It says, "Are movies considered art by now? If so, is there a title that enforced this idea? Could we make a game like that as well?" This is in response to the old debate of whether games can be considered art, and as a non-gamer I would have to say yes, there's no reason why they shouldn't be. I'm not someone like a very great film critic who I think was completely wrong on this issue, Roger Ebert, who said games can never be considered art. I think games are absolutely a form of art which I just happen to be not that interested in. But they do intersect with a form of art that I do love, cinema, and they intersect in ways that I think everyone agrees are often completely terrible. Now, why is this? Like I say, I don't think it's because games aren't art, although I think games have an unusual position where they are, as the name suggests, a game like football or chess, but they also have elements like storytelling and acting and other things that make them lean more towards art than they do rugby. This is perhaps a reason why most movies based on games are so terrible. It's possible to make a good movie based on, say, a tennis match. If someone asked you to make a movie based on the entire sport of tennis, you would probably be a bit perplexed by that. So there is no great video game movie, and that's fine. I think there are great video game moments in movies, one of which I will address at the end of this video. But I think one of the other problems you're facing here is this use of the term art as being basically interchangeable with good. And that's not quite true. I've mentioned before that I'm quite fond of a lot of things like performance art and conceptual art, which on the rare occasions when they do break out into popular culture are discussed on the level of whether they are art or not. And it always seems to me to be a profoundly dumb question. Yes, they're art, they're in an art gallery. What you're trying to say is, I think this is bad art, which is an arguable point. Some conceptual art is indeed terrible, but by saying it's not art, it almost shifts the burden of having to actually argue that. There's even a specifically film-related equivalent to this misperception, which is the word auteur. Now, when auteur theory was developed by the critics for Cahiers du Cinéma magazine in the 1950s, it basically referred to a worldview that the director is the person who should be seen as the author in French, of the film. This was not a commonly held view at the time. The studio system ruled the roost in Hollywood. Films like The Wizard of Oz or Casino Royale got through umpteen directors because those directors that they hired were failing to match the producer's vision. And that's what it was at that point, the producer's vision. So when the auteur theory came about, it was quite revolutionary. The problem it had, ironically, was that the Cahiers du Cinéma critics, which included a lot of future legendary directors like Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Rohmer, Jacques Rivette, Francois Truffaut, were almost too good at arguing this point. When they wanted to argue that film directors were as great an artist as any novelist, they tended to pick people like Howard Hawks, Alfred Hitchcock, Fritz Lang, Nicholas Ray, people who are now completely universally accepted as serious artists. It seems absolutely inconceivable that there was a time when people had to actually fervently argue that Alfred Hitchcock was actually quite good. But they did. And that's why the word auteur now gets misapplied. People think auteur must mean a director who is particularly good. According to auteur theory, every director is an auteur, providing that they don't actually have their film taken away and re-edited against their wishes. Auteur is not a value judgment, just as art is not a value judgment. It should be possible for someone to be a bad auteur, just as it's possible for someone to be a bad artist. In popular discussion, of course, this isn't the case. An auteur is always a serious director, and art is always a term of appreciation. I don't know quite when this change came about. I can't imagine it was in place during the Renaissance, say, where people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo were basically plasterers, I guess, really good painters and decorators. They were hired by the richest people in Europe to decorate the inside of that whole Sistine ceiling business they've got, and they did a professional job which didn't necessarily give you many insights into their personal imaginations. This started to change in the late 18th and 19th centuries with the rise of Romanticism in art. Romanticism held that the artist's way of seeing the world was actually paramount, and art that was done out of passion was much more important than art that was done on commission. You can still see in a lot of ways that our view of what art is shaped by Romanticism. But there was another thing too. Halfway through the 19th century, you had photography come about. Suddenly the whole raison d'etre of visual art got replaced. A landscape used to be about showing you what the landscape looked like, but now you can just take a photograph of that, so what's the point? The point eventually became to show you how a particular artist sees the landscape, and that eventually leads you directly via Cézanne onto abstract art, surrealism and other forms of modern art. Of course, the other major artistic technological development of the late 19th century was movies. And our Twitter questioner is sort of right. They weren't considered art initially. The question of how they got to be considered art, though, is a bit thornier. By the late 1920s, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had been set up, so clearly the debate had reached a conclusion by the time Wings had been released. But in terms of how it got there, there's not really any one answer. Looking back in retrospect, we can identify films like The Great Train Robbery, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Metropolis, Citizen Kane, films that obviously raised the bar for how intelligent and how artistically successful a film could be. They weren't always the films being rewarded. Metropolis got terrible reviews at the time, including from no less a personage than H.G. Wells, who said it was the stupidest film he'd ever seen. If you look at the text of Metropolis, it is a bit stupid. I mean, it ends with capital and labour basically shaking hands and agreeing not to be jerks with each other in the future. The true scale of Metropolis's achievement was based on its visuals, its ambition, its editing, its construction. But those things weren't really being appreciated that much in the early days of cinema. If you look at the early films that won Oscars, and please try to contain your astonishment at the idea that the Oscars sometimes get it wrong, you will find a lot of adaptations of great novels and plays. You will find biopics of noble people like Louis Pasteur and Émile Zola. But oftentimes, the films that really pushed the medium forward are left out. This is because the Oscars were trying to measure the idea of film as art within existing parameters of art. They were saying, what's a film that's as good as a great novel or a great play? They often missed the films like Metropolis that did things that could only be done within movies because they didn't have a framework to talk about that yet. So the answer to the question is, disappointingly, you probably can't replicate the movies that led to movies being considered art within a video game context, unless you make a video game based on the life of Émile Zola, which personally I would absolutely love to see. Oh yeah, I've defeated the final level boss of 19th century French anti-Semitism! The games that in the future will lead to more serious artistic study of games are the ones where games do something that cannot be measured against the classiness, I guess you'd say, the artistic quality of mediums that are not games. So how then do I think that films and games can have a more fruitful artistic conversation? One where they can take the best of each other, but also recognise that they are different mediums trying different things. Well, I think there are a few films that have given me the sense of a game-influenced narrative. I think art films with branching, complex and non-linear narratives like, say, Sex and Lucia, feel like video games in a way that most video game adaptations do not. I could, incidentally, have also mentioned Inland Empire or Mulholland Drive there, but I've decided to have a week off from talking about There's also one particular scene which I think is fascinating as a very early example of how games can influence movies in more interesting ways. It's in Pulp Fiction. It's when Bruce Willis's character Butch has escaped from the rapists and he's going out to try and get a weapon that he could use to fight back. And in a normal film, he would grab the first deadly thing that came to hand and charge straight back in there. In Pulp Fiction, he goes through several different alternatives. Part of the reason for that is because it's quite funny to see an action hero, and an action hero played by Bruce Willis, the quintessential action star, dithering about not quite knowing what to do. But there's also something that's a bit gamish about that. The idea that before the mission can be completed, you have to choose your weapon. And every weapon he chooses could lead the movie down a different path, you feel. If he went back in there with a gun, it would be an action movie. If he went back in there with the chainsaw, it would be a horror movie. In the end, he chooses the katana, and it becomes a kind of grubby, downbeat samurai film for a bit. That's an example of how a linear narrative like film can use the branching narrative of games to enrich it. At best, it can show you that there's a whole new world out there, and yes, it is art.